This episode of Back to the Roots podcast is brought to you by Byron Seeds. The folks at Byron Seeds believe organic requires a different perspective, plan, and approach. Organic isn't simply a different type of product or even a different way of farming. It's a different way of thinking, planning, commitment. It's a different philosophy on how to feed the world. Many won't understand, but the people at Byron Seeds do. We're owned by organic dairy farmers. We not only have the product, but we plan, manage, and execute organic. We speak your language, we share your struggles, and we laud your successes. Organic isn't a way of doing business, it's a community. We learn from each other. We're in this together. We'd be glad to talk cropping plans, management systems, the road to profitability. We understand what you're trying to do. We're farmers just like you. Visit us at byronseeds.net or give us a call at 800-801-3596. And thanks to Byron Seeds.
You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast, and today we are in Berlin, Ohio at the Amish and Mennonite Heritage Center with Marcus Yoder, who's the executive director and also just gave us a tour of the painting called Behalt. So Marcus, thank you so much for joining us, and can you give us a little bit of your background?
Sure. I'm a son of this community, the Holmes County Amish and Mennonite community. I was born 4 miles from where we're at here and lived my first 25 years of my life here. I grew up on in a small family farm. I love the idea of land ownership and farm and farming. I actually work for my grandfather on the farm. I'd rather not milk cows by hand anymore, but it is a special place. And then I kind of went on a circuitous journey outside of this community. And sometimes you have to step outside of something to see the good that's in it. So in my 30s, through a series of events, I became interested in education and decided to go back to school. I went to The Ohio State University, and my wife followed me, my wife Narita. We do not have children, so we're a little different than many of the people. But in 2010, I graduated from Ohio State. I am a historian. She graduated in 2011. We're still with the Amish Mennonite community of this world, in the Holmes County world. And then we did what many people don't do, and we said, let's try to get into the best grad schools in the world in our field. And I'm interested in our people, the Amish and Mennonite people. What makes us who we are? Why do we live in Holmes County? Why do we have this deep attachment to our land? These places, and I touched some on that at Ohio State, but I want more. So we applied to Yale University and St. Andrews in Scotland, and we thought, well, okay, so we'll decide with the selection process, and we applied separately, and both got accepted into both places. So we had to make a choice, and Yale offered more money.
Okay, I was just going to say, how is that a choice?
We wanted to go to St. Andrews, but Yale. And we're so glad we did. That was a really good experience. But what my grad school experience allowed me to do was really dig into our world and say, what is it that makes the plain people, the Amish and Mennonites of the world, what is it that holds us together? What is it that binds us? And towards the tail end of grad school, I'd already been involved here at the center as a board member and as an interim director. At the tail end of grad school, we were thinking and praying about what to do. And we both are interested in giving back to our world. So many of our people who have gotten an education have left our world. And I want to give back. And we chose to move back into this community. And we love this world and this community. The adjustments have been difficult, and our world has changed in the 15 years that we were gone outside of this community. But it is still our home. There's something about when I drive down 62 and turn left at the bottom of the Seven Lake Hill and go north and then come to that lane and go into that long lane that leads into my grandpa's place, and it's the home place. And there's something that happens in my heart, in my psyche, when I connect to the land of my people like that.
Mm-hmm. And when did you start working here full time?
Full time I worked here from 2012 to 2013. Then we went to Yale, and then after Yale in 2016, I started full time here. Mm-hmm. I've been to director ever since. What we offer here, we have this really unique gift. We have a painting that is 10 feet high, 265 feet long, that depicts the history of our people. And the painting is painted by one man, Heinz Gogel. I was telling you two about this. Heinz is a German. He was born in Germany, he was born in Germany in the 30s, early 30s, 1930s, and was forcibly drafted by Hitler's army at 17. When Hitler was running out of soldiers, they drafted younger and younger. And he was a Nazi soldier, but was shot at the Battle of the Bulge, wounded, and rescued by some American army officers, and decided to make it, as he's laying in the snow in the Ardennes, he decides to make it his life story to bring peace to the world. And the way he did that was through his art.
Mm-hmm. And you had mentioned that he immigrated to Canada.
Yeah.
Then?
He was a naturalized Canadian citizen who in the 1970s, in a very fateful journey, was looking for some glazed brick for a project he was working in Canada called the Hands of Industry. And he drove from Toronto to Columbus to look at some brick. And about 6 hours in that journey, you get to Berlin. And he stopped for lunch. And as he walked outside the restaurant, he heard several Amish men speaking Pennsylvania Dutch, the language of our people. It is very similar to Schwabisch, which is the language of southern Germany. And he heard that and fell in love, understood it as the language of his own people, and decided to inquire more and became enamored. And within a very short time, a week, he decided to come to this area, do more research, and then eventually move to this area and paint our history. So he's an outsider who moved in, saw the wonder of this, moved in, and gave us this tremendous gift. So I give you a visual picture or an audio, a picture of this kind of visual feast. So the painting has at least 1,260 figures that we've been able to identify. It took Heinz 14 years to paint. It is one of there are only 4 active cycloramas in the United States, and it is the only one painted by one person. The others are teams of artists. But it is vibrant color, and everything is woven together. And so it's much like history. History has no chapters. Somebody didn't get up one morning and say, well, I think I'll start a Reformation today. It comes out of the world, and the painting does so well at depicting that coming out of the world that it developed in. And so Heinz, it's a wonderful, so the visual, the colors of the background, the size of the figures, they all speak to the experiences.
And I'll just add, people have to come and just see it to really get a handle on it. But when we walked in and the lights were off, and this is the first time I've been here, and you flip the lights on, and it's a new experience. it's an experience that you don't get very often, to just like be not overwhelmed, but just kind of shocked at what it is you're seeing, just the beauty of the art in front of you. It's incredible.
My first time I ever toured it as a young man, I've always loved history. By the way, my love for history, when I was 6 or 7, my parents got swindled into buying a set of World Book encyclopedias. I still remember how the salesman looked, by the way. He was short and stout, and he wore a double knit tie that only came about halfway down his chest because of his size, and he wore this really bad cologne. But my parents got talked into it, and when the books came, I loved to read anyway. I thought you were supposed to read them. So I started with A and read everything that interests, and that instilled a great love of history and in me. So I know more about aardvarks and zebras than many people do mindless facts. But I love history. And I remember walking into the first time and doing the half-hour tour like you did. And at the end of the tour thinking, we can't be done yet. We can't be. And we once estimated if we were to talk about each person, it would take 60 to 70 hours to really just give it full shrift of what it needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you come in there, and it's crazy how fast a half hour goes, because as you go around there, all of a sudden you're back to the beginning, like, because you're going around in a circle, you don't know where you are, and all of a sudden you're back around, and wow.
Yeah.
It's I know my dad was saying that the Amish youth, before they get baptized,
Mm-hmm.
they come here and do, is that the 3-hour tour?
It's right at 2 hours, that tour.
And he said that's where you really get in deep.
Yeah. We generally use several tour guides, and we each work in our strength, and it just makes for a really full experience.
Mm-hmm. So I would like you to kind of take us through the painting if you can.
Sure.
I know we're not sitting in front of the painting, but I would really like you to go through the history of the Anabaptists, because my dad gave us in our initial first episode, he talked about the history of the Amish, but this goes back way before the Amish, and it's a much bigger scope. So if you wouldn't mind kind of walking us from the beginning to the end, I guess.
The painting begins with the figure of Jesus. So the Anabaptist faith, where the Amish, the Mennonite, the Brethren, the Hutterites are from, is a traditional Christian, has traditional Christian viewpoints on issues of faith and belief. The early church was very clearly apolitical, and that changed in 300 when Constantine, the young Roman emperor, who was, by the way, fighting his first cousin, who was married to his sister, brother-in-law and first cousin. I bet they had bad family get-togethers, but anyway, was fighting him for control of the Roman Empire. And in a famous event, says he saw, either at a trance or at a dream, saw a sign saying, a sign come down from heaven saying, "In this sign conquer." And he painted on his men's shields and banners, and they won the battle. And he attributed it to the God of the Christians. And that actually, a few months later, 3 months later, he legalized Christianity for the first time in 313. And that changed Christianity. It gave it a lot of freedom, but it also changed the empire. Now, within a very short time, the empire and Christianity had embraced and become kind of one. And there's an uneasy alliance between church and state from here on out. And through the period that we know as the medieval times, or the Dark Ages, from about 500 AD to 1500 AD, there's always groups of people who are coming, kind of saying, "No, wait, is this the right way to go?" You have the Waldensians, the Hussites, John Wycliffe in England. And the Reformation, it's easy for us to, in the modern world, to look back and say the Reformation began in 1517 when Martin Luther. The Reformation began long before that, as people began to question, and these ideas came to a foment, and Europe is filled with peasant revolts. The peasants, the poor people, are saying, "Wait, how does that ruler allowed to do that to us, tax us like that? How can a pope all the way down in Rome dictate what we do today?" And these peasant revolts happen. And the Reformation comes out of that world. So there's four things that happen that lead to the Reformation. First of all, is there is a deep piety. We look back at that era, and it's easy for us to assume that these are Dark Ages. People didn't know it. These are people like you and I. They have emotions, feelings. So there's a deep piety. There's also a huge power structure. The Holy Roman Empire is the largest group of nations allied around Christianity, and led by an emperor. So piety, power, and then the plague. Talk about modern renditions of this. The plague first hit Europe in 1348, and it was probably brought to Europe by the Mongols, because it was carried first by marmots, the little groundhog-like animal, and the Mongols had a man die of it, and they threw that man's body into an Italian city that they besieged, and that spread in Italy and then spread north. And in 4 years' time, from 1348 to 1352, at least, conservatively, at least a third of the population of Europe died because of the plague. So coronavirus is a small thing compared to that. Mm-hmm. In large cities like Paris and London, which are the two largest, 60% of the population sometimes died in a season. And it would ebb during the winter, rise in the summer. So you have the piety, the power, the plague, and then there is also the printing press. The ability to spread information rapidly and to preserve information. The printing press does those two things. It spreads it, but it also, you have 20 copies of something, 15 are destroyed, you still have 5. If there's only 1 copy, then it's destroyed, it's gone. So the printing press, so those 4 Ps, if you want to call it that, lead to the Reformation. And in the Reformation, there is a group of people who begin to say, wait, should we not, is there not another way here? And should Christianity not be bigger than a political alliance? And it begins in Zurich, Switzerland in the 1520s. And a small group of very smart graduate students, essentially, begin to say the New Testament is clear that only those who can make a conscious decision to follow Jesus should be part of the church. And in the Zwingli, Lutheran, Catholic world, all citizens are Christians. And these people are dangerous. They are upsetting the religious ideals of Europe, but they're also upsetting the political structure by saying Christianity is bigger than this small alliance. But they're also upsetting the social norms of the day. In that world, poor people and rich people didn't mix. And this group of people said, doesn't matter who you are, as long as you make a decision to follow Jesus. And so they kind of upset the entire social norms. And in 1525, the first baptisms happened in Zurich, Switzerland, and they're almost immediately persecuted. And persecution goes on until the 1700s in parts of Europe, mid-1700s. One of the chief ways that they persecuted them initially was capital punishment. We estimate maybe 5,000 people died, but that's a pretty large number. And Anabaptism did spread really in German-speaking areas. They're called Anabaptists not because they're anti-Baptist, but they're in Latin and Greek, when you re-baptizers are called Ana, A-N-A. And in the 1530s, then a young monk, priest from the Netherlands becomes a prominent leader named Menno Simons, and his followers become known as Mennonites. At the same time, there's a group who believe in communal living, and they're followers of Jacob Hutter, and they become known as Hutterites. And then, as David so ably put it, it's in the right at 1700 when a rift develops in the Mennonite church, and a group more concerned about fervor develops a revivalist movement, and they're called Almenslight after their follower, or Amanish, or Amish. So those are the 3 principal groups of Anabaptism, but let's back up. The persecution spread Anabaptism, but one of the chief ways they persecuted is they didn't permit Anabaptists to own land. They're dissenters, so they're not permitted to own land. And so land ownership is a huge question, and they would move into areas, farm the king's or the noble's land until it was really built well, and then people would begin to say, but they're not like us, and then they have to move again. So they're very good farmers. They're the first people. They bring these Swiss practices of manure spreading, using lime on land, those kind of practices. They bring them north into southern Germany. By the way, those of us who are Amish also know one of our food dishes is Swiss cheese. We're good at Swiss cheese. And that's because you go over there and it just fits. They're the first cheesemakers in the Rhine Valley because they bring it from the Swiss highlands. They also make a dish with hot milk and dough balls in it. They call it a Rivelsoup. And they eat Rivelsoup in the 1600s, and we still eat it today. Holmes County is the only area where you can talk about Rivelsoup and people know what it is. It's because we brought it.
So the movement north, was that Amish and Mennonites as well, and the Hutterites, or were they like 3 separate groups already?
Good question. The Hutterites are east in Moravia. And by the way, the Hutterites become, by 1600, the Hutterites, they're about 30,000 strong. And they are Europe's best smiths, their best farmers, their best educators, and their best doctors. One of the emperors sent his child to a Hutterite colony to be doctored. And then the Turks invade and push north across the colonies. And in the space of 10 years' time, from 1600 to about 1610, the Hutterites go from 30,000 people to 30 people. They embrace the Anabaptist ideal of not defending themselves, so many of them are carried into slavery. The 30 wander east into Russia, and settled there, joined by some Mennonites later, and then eventually to the Prairie States. But then the Mennonites moved north from Switzerland, and the rift develops in the Rhine Valley right at 1700 when the Amish and Mennonite split happened.
And the Hutterites, the distinction between, at that point in time, the Hutterites and the Mennonites would have been the colonies versus the community, correct?
Yeah. Communal living. The Hutterites owned land in common, and in that world lived in large common houses. Each family is its own unit. Many of your listeners would know about Hutterites today. They raise potatoes in the colonies, in the western states particularly, but still today they embrace that common land ownership and those kind of things. So that's the biggest difference.
Mm-hmm. Are there still Hutterites in Russia now?
They're not.
They all moved.
They all moved to the Americas.
Okay, because there's a lot in Canada as well, right?
They had primarily settled in the northern plains states. Then in World War I, there was no provision for conscientious objectors. And 2 Hutterite boys actually lost their lives at Fort Leavenworth for refusing to wear the uniform. And as a result of that, 17 of the 18 colonies moved to Canada, where there was more freedom than the United States during World War II. So they're about equally spread now in Canada and the United States. Mm-hmm. Probably more in Canada.
So let's backtrack to the division between the Amish and Mennonites to start, which that was with Jacob Ammann.
Yeah.
So can you kind of keep
and
going from there?
Our world gets bigger after that. So in the 1730s, the late 1600s, the first Mennonites immigrate to the New World, early 1690s, and they settle at Germantown in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia suburb. And the first paper mill in the United States is owned by Mennonites, the Rittenhouse family. By the way, they were sold to the Scott Paper Company later, and now they make toilet paper there. So the Mennonites are instrumental in the development of toilet paper. I love telling people those little facts. But so by 1690, there's Mennonites in Philadelphia. In the 1730s, the first Amish come to Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and then Berks County, Pennsylvania. And the genetic pool is really small. For those of you who know anything about the Amish world, the Yoders, the Millers, the Hirschbergers, the Masts, and the Troyers, those 5 last names, by the way, make up about 70% of our community. But the genetic pool is probably about 300 people total who immigrated from 1730 to 1770. And then the Amish groups in like Bern, Indiana, in Michigan, and some of those places, they immigrated about 100 years later in the early 18 teens and 20s. And their names are names like Hilty and Schwartz and names like that. But the first wave of immigration settled in Berks County. Then in the Revolutionary War, both sides wanted their boys. So many of them moved on west. And Berks County is kind of where many of the Valley Forge isn't far away, and Yorktown. And so they moved on west to Somerset County, Pennsylvania, where the Penn family had just bought some land from the Indians and settled there. I am working on a book-length manuscript of a little girl who was born in Germany in 1730. Think about somebody's life like this. Born in 1730 in Germany, at 7 years old, her family immigrated to America. She married a man named John Miller. There's 87 John Millers in our community itself, by the way. But anyway, married John Miller, John and Magdalena Miller. And when she's a 27-year-old Amish lady with 4 children, her husband, in a surprise attack by a group of Native Americans led by a French captain, was shot in the hand, was wounded and crippled, call him Crippled John the rest of his life, or Indian John. And then in the 1770s, by now she's past the age of childbearing. They have 11 children. Then their family moves on west to Somerset County, Pennsylvania. And her oldest son, Jacob, then moves on west in 1809 while Magdalena is still living and settles in Holmes County. And to think about that chain of the stories that Magdalena told. And so that's our story. That's what brings us. And I want to in Europe, we weren't permitted to own land. When we settled in the United States, the Amish and Mennonites, one of the things that they made a deep commitment to is land ownership. And they put their roots down deep into this land. And we can ask the question, why did they move like from Berks to Somerset? That was primarily because of the Revolutionary War. But they're always looking for more land. And it becomes very deeply equated to our freedom and our non-persecution is the ability to own land. So land is a huge part of our world. But there are still Mennonites in Europe in the 1700s, about when the Amish are immigrating to America. And by the way, Amish and Mennonites immigrated to America, sometimes together, but there's a coolness between the two because there is a difference. And some of the Mennonites from Holland moved east to Prussia, and then from Prussia to Russia, where they settled on the steppes of the Ukraine and became the largest agricultural producing colonies in all of Russia. By 1870, they produced 7% of the agricultural output of Russia is produced by Mennonites in the Ukraine. They produced nearly all the farm machinery in Russia. They had the most forward-looking factories. And then Russia went on a Russification, they call it, where these people are still speaking German and Dutch, and they don't speak Russian, and they're large landowners. Some of them own 50,000 acres. And they use native peasants, and there's a tension there. And then in the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, they lost everything. And many of them were sent to Siberia, disappeared into the gulags of communism. And some of them managed to hang on until the 1940s when the German armies liberated, it's a loose term here, but liberated that area, and they fled west. And the American Mennonites, through MCC, helped many of them immigrate to Paraguay and those places. But a small group remained there until the walls fell. In fact, I was in a church in Germany that's made up of Russian immigrants, and we sang a song, and these old people all cried. And then they said, we sang those songs in Siberia, in the prison camps. And they were in prison because they were Mennonite. So there's still a small presence of Mennonites. And in Europe, there's still some Mennonite churches, particularly in the Rhine Valley. But so in the Crimean War, in the 1870s, those Russian Mennonites developed hospitals and things like that. So in America, we have had relative freedom as Amish and Mennonites to practice our faith. A strong tenet of our faith is our non-resistance. And yet there's been questions about that in our world. And so sometimes it's hard for us to know how to live as a good part of our community and world, and yet embrace our beliefs. And that often leads me to think about the kind of three pieces that cement our communities together. The first of all is our historic faith. It is a deep part of us. These stories of martyrdom, they may seem gruesome and gory, but yet they make up peace. And here's one example. At the center point of the painting is the story of Dirk Willems. And Dirk is a Mennonite preacher, and in 1569 is captured for his faith. He's a thin, light man, made even thinner by time in prison, and he escaped prison. And he was seen by someone, and they pursued him, and he ran across a canal with thin ice. And as he ran across that canal, he made it safely across. His pursuer was heavier and fell through. Dirk heard his pursuer fall through the ice, turned around, and helped his pursuer out of the ice. And his pursuer wanted to let him go. His colleagues said no way. And 2.5 weeks later, Dirk was burned at the stake for turning around and helping his fellow man. And when Heinz Gogol, who painted the painting, read that story in this book that we have called The Martyr's Mirror, he said, that is what epitomizes Anabaptism. You're willing to give your life, but not take life. So we believe in life and giving life, even in our farming. There's been a real strong movement saying, how can we bring life to the soil? And that's a healthy part of who we are. So we've told that story, and I'm guessing most Amish young people have heard that story at some point. Amish and Mennonite young people have heard that story at some point. And so those stories are a strong part of our faith. You won't hear us talking a lot about our faith. We don't just go out and proselytize and things like that. We think living it is a better way of showing it. Mm-hmm. So faith is the first one. The second one is our families. These deep family connections. My Amish friends walk right past my degrees from the Ohio State University and Yale. And they say, now, who is your grandpa? And I'll say, I'm Monroe's, Milo's, Leroy's, Marcus. Oh, yeah, they say, you're my first cousin once removed on my mother's side. And my wife, who is not from this community, will poke me and say, so is the other half of Holmes County. But those things really do mean something. Mm-hmm. And when we can make those family connections, it means something. Mm-hmm. So faith, family, and then, for the lack of another F, the farm. This deep commitment to land. Mm-hmm. And there are farms in this community where 8 generations have lived. They still have the original deeds, sheepskin deeds signed by Jefferson and James Monroe. They have them in their homes. And it's something they're very committed to.
And I think that is so ingrained in us that you see people leave the larger Amish communities like Holmes County to find land where there's more land available, so their children will have the opportunity to farm. You have quite a bit of movement from here into New York right now, and I guess I never really looked at how important ownership is until you mentioned during our tour about rental properties here. Yeah. The amount of Amish and Mennonite people that actually rent their whole lives, well, there's not many. I mean, everybody wants to have that piece of land, and that goes back hundreds of years.
Yeah, 400 years in some cases. It is amazing to me. It took me going outside the community and kind of looking back into it and saying, this is a gift. It can be a little close sometimes, as Mike well knows. You know, everybody knows each other. Mm-hmm. My mom called me a couple of years ago and said, what were you doing at the drive-thru? You know, where you buy alcohol. And Mom, I wasn't at the drive-thru. And she said, yeah, your truck was there. Who told you my truck? Well, Aunt Sarah said she saw your truck at the drive. And that can, I wasn't at the drive-thru as somebody who had a truck like mine. But it shows you the smallness of our world. Mm-hmm. We all know each other. But there's almost no world where it's safer to have something bad happen to you than this world, because we'll take care of each other.
Mm-hmm. That's the one thing, along with the negativity of having everybody know what you're doing. Yeah. There's also that comfort when things go wrong. Those same people are there to support each other in this small community.
Yes. It is a gift.
So when you go back to the Amish coming to America, were there any Amish going into other parts of Europe, or was it primarily, did all the Amish leave that region and come to the United States?
About half of them left. So there's Amish. There was Amish in the Emmental Valley of Switzerland and in the Rhine Valley near Strasbourg, France now, until the 1930s. And then they joined some of the Mennonite churches that were still there. So there's no distinctive Amish or even Mennonites in Europe today. They're acculturated, although they still have Mennonite churches and embrace Mennonite theology. But it's the 1930s that the last Amish church disbanded in Europe.
Because are those Mennonites in Ireland, or are they Beach Amish?
They're Beach Amish who came from America back to Ireland. There are some mission groups, particularly among the kind of the middle of the Mennonite church, that the middle 2/3, where they've in Poland, in Ireland, and in Germany, where there's some mission movements led by Mennonites.
But they would have immigrated here and then went back.
There are Amish Mennonite families from here who, in our lifetime, moved there.
Mm-hmm. But was the movement for the Amish to leave that region, was it primarily for the promises of the United States with land ownership, or was there persecution there, or was it kind of fizzling?
There is still persecution, not capital in the sense of being, but people are still, they're still not permitted to have their own church services, not supposed to. That's why they meet in homes. And they're not allowed to, one of the agreements they made was not to build church buildings. They meet in homes and barns. There's that, and there's almost continual warfare during this time. Napoleonic Wars and all these wars in Europe. And And Europe is also changing. It's becoming, for instance, Germany is becoming a nation and things like that. So I say that to say that it's kind of maybe three things here. So there's persecution. There's still persecution. And then there is also a pietistic movement. I don't want to get too theological, but there's a pietistic movement that's happening, particularly in Lutheranism, that is pulling some of their young people into it. And they're scared of that. They want their young people to stay in their circles. And then there's a promise of land. But the biggest thing is that promise of land. But it's tied to the persecution because they're not permitted land ownership. And William Penn has really good real estate agents who travel through Europe, and they see these Amish and Mennonite people as good additions to the New World. Mm-hmm. Can you imagine what that was like? I've often tried to imagine as you get off the ship in Philadelphia, everyone speaks English, and you move in the big woods. Europe doesn't have any of that. Wolves and Indians and these fearful things. And you get to a place and you think, this is mine. I own this. And think about the deep connectedness that brings to the land.
Mm-hmm. But imagine, like, if I go on a vacation for a week, I want to have my plan mapped out. I want my hotels. I can't imagine getting off a ship in a brand new world and heading toward land.
The ship's journey to America, not just for Amish and Mennonites, but for all people, is fraught with danger. The statistics from 1730 to 1770, when the Amish immigrated, we know for instance, this is the one story of Magdalena. She immigrated on a ship called the Charming Nancy. She and her parents, and John Miller and his parents are both 7 years old at the time. And there's 11 Amish families, the largest group that we know of, that went in one trip. And the bishop who was along, Hans Kaufman, John Kaufman, he kept a little journal, and he had 26 funerals in 13 weeks, and 24 of them were for children. So the average life expectancy of a child 7 years old and younger to survive the journey is 50%. Wow. Overall. And the average life expectancy of a child, an infant 1 year old or younger, is only 10%. So what makes young families, and they're primarily young families with children, actually leave a world that they've known and go into the unknown? The Charming Nancy, nothing charming about it, but it took, they were becalmed, sailing ships, so they were becalmed, which is horrible. And hundreds of people died overall, but they left Cowes, England, and they were 13 and a half weeks at sea before they got to Philadelphia, which is exceptionally long. Most journeys are 6 to 9 weeks. And in that 13 and a half weeks, they saw one other ship. Can you imagine that world? And it's impossible for us today to fathom it. Mm-hmm. But what makes young families pick up and move in it? It is primarily about the freedoms that America offered. Land ownership. Mm-hmm. And the Penn family was absolutely instrumental in bringing these groups, bigger than just the Amish Mennonites, but these kind of religious groups that were being persecuted in Europe, to the Americas.
Which that was also probably an easier sell to people that were under some sort of persecution, to have, well, hey, there's this country where you can worship as you please. So it was probably a kind of low-hanging fruit too, because you had the two things. You had the persecution and you had the promise of land ownership. Mm-hmm. So
the two really played into it. Mm-hmm. There's also, it is true that they're part of a larger Germanic movement west into the Americas. Large portions of Pennsylvania during this time spoke German because they're primarily German immigrants. It is a unique world. It's easy for us to assume it's kind of a Laura Ingalls world. It's not. It's a world that has a lot of potential for illness and death.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to, you guys both mentioned beachy Amish, and I just, as I've learned more about the Amish community, as I learn about the different sects of the Amish church, and you got the Schwarzen Trooper and the Beachy and the Old Order, New Order. And as far as from a historical standpoint, is that more recent history as they've come to America and just kind of had these natural splits, or was that something that happened back in the old world as well?
No, there's one group of Amish who come to America, the Amish. And the divisions, it's easy for us to be hard on ourselves as Amish Mennonite people today, and say, but this happens in every group. As it grows, there's outliers. And those outliers develop small followings, and then they kind of break away and begin their own process. So today, in the Holmes County community, for instance, there's at least 11 different major kinds of Amish that they'll work back and forth at projects like barn raisings and all that, but they won't share communion, which is kind of the place that divides. And they will say, no, this is not about being inclusive or anything, or exclusive. This is about saying we've banded together to say this is how we do it. And it's okay for other people to do it a different way, but this is how we do it.
And is that all down to interpretation of the Bible, or is that back to, is that going to be an unanswerable question?
That is the $1 million question right there.
Well, it's about culture.
Yeah.
It's about how actively to be involved in the modern culture.
Okay. Yeah.
And people like your dad, Mike's dad, David, he and I had a talk we talked about this, and he said, everyone embraces a culture. So I'm choosing to embrace a different one than people around me. It's okay that they embrace what they do. And I think that's a good answer. I actually think that's a good answer. In the Mennonite world, then, the biggest difference, let me say this about the difference between Amish and Mennonites. Amish, the largest difference is automobile ownership and church houses. So the Amish do not have church houses, Mennonites do. And there's still Mennonites who drive horse and buggy, so that is the defining point. And I understand this. So your church, you go to church with your neighbors. It's a geographical district, about 30 families. And if you take that away and you have this large church building, then suddenly people from down here could come up, and it forces you to get along in your neighborhood if you want to remain Amish. And so even on issues like car ownership, they'll say it's not wrong to drive in a car. But think about this, that the rationale that they use to make decisions is different than the modern world. They'll say, how will it affect our historic faith? How will it affect our families? And how will it affect our community and way of living? And if it negatively affects that, we'd rather not do it. So we'll drive with cars, we'll hire a taxi. But if we own cars, it's going to radically change our family. And we don't want that. And I think that's a good decision-making process. It's different than many people in America. It's an equally good way to do it.
Mm-hmm. It takes away the individualism to a certain degree, where as a society we're very individualistic, but that decision is made for the whole. And lots of times there will be people within that decision that might disagree, but they will agree with the bigger decision because it's better for the whole, even though they personally might not necessarily agree with it.
Mike, did you ever think about it? Like, if you go to an Amish gathering, I really like your hats, by the way. Oh. These guys are wearing these wonderful hats. Organic Valley.
Oh, no. Back to the Roots podcast.
Back to the Roots podcast. Yeah, hats. Beautiful hats.
Thank you.
They look like they're stylish. In the Amish world, rich and poor look the very same on Sunday morning. And they know the differences, but when you look into it, they all look the same. And a part of that is about saying, this is about the community. I care more about the community than my ability to wear Calvin Klein. Or back to the Roots hats.
Well, it's like my dad said, what he likes about it is he's got one suit for church.
Yeah.
So you never have to worry about, what am I going to wear to church? Said it's always the same thing.
Yeah.
Well, and it's also, like your dad said, it sounds like that mindset carries over into education as well. With the 8th grade education. Everybody comes out of school with the same baseline. Nobody is viewed as, well, and I'm talking to somebody that went to Yale, nobody's viewed on a different level because they had a different level of education.
Yeah, it's exactly right.
And I think it's wonderful that you went to Ohio State and Yale and then came back to the community to give, because just like you mentioned earlier, lots of people, when, like, my son is in college right now, like, what are the odds that I can convince him to stay in our community here? And, when I was younger, I thought, like, leaving this would be wonderful. The older I get, I realize how much I like the roots here and how important that is. And actually, Brian made me step back when we started working together, made me step back and realize how great some of the things are in our community that I took for granted, because you looked at it from a different lens. And I think there's so many strong traditions that are so unique, and we can't lose those.
That's really good, because at the very beginning I talked about, going in that driveway, that home place. When you step outside of something, sometimes you're so close to something you can't see the good. And when you step away from it and then return, you suddenly see the gift. And what our world has a lot of problems, the Amish Mennonite world. There's things we need to deal with. But they also give us a tremendous gift in having a safe place, a safe world. I grew up in a really safe world, as did Mike. And
sheltered in a way.
Sheltered.
I mean, and when I mean sheltered, I mean that in a good way.
Yes.
Because sometimes when you say that, boy, they sheltered their kids too much, that's a negative. But in the sense of community here, it's a wonderful thing.
And as our community progresses, we're going to have to deal with the influence of media. Suddenly, media is much more prevalent in our world than it ever was, among all of us. We're going to have to deal with the effects of those things. But I have a lot of faith in our world. And a lot of it is built around the three things: our faith, our family, and our farms. When that's our grid work in decision making, it changes the way we make decisions about whether we should do something or not.
Well, I'll say, as a person that did not grow up in this community or this type of community or an Amish community at all, when I first started working in northern Indiana in that community, you look at what is happening there, and there's some things that you're like, well, what? No, what? Why? Don't. And I talk to people, family and friends, and, oh, you work with the Amish? Why do they do this? Why do they do that? And, to have the painting in there gives the history, and like you're talking, there are these principles that have been built on, now 2,100 years of history, and there's a reason behind it. It may not always be easily explainable, but at the base are those three things, and that's beautiful.
I think one of the real threats in the Plain community is the lack of, the farming.
Yeah.
Because it used to be 90% were in agriculture. Now it's 10% are and 90 aren't. So when you look at the way that the Plain lifestyle, it totally, neighbors helping neighbors, it's agriculture. Because when a neighbor has a problem, well, a farmer will just drop what he's doing and go help the neighbor. If you leave at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to your job, you're not going to be around and find out when. So I think that's kind of a threat, and I think that's why we're seeing communities start in other areas with more land availability, because they want to get back to the agrarian roots that we have.
And I applaud what you are doing at Organic Valley and Back to the Roots, because I think that, and today, there's Amish in 37 states?
I'm not even sure.
Canadian provinces and Argentina, small group in Argentina. So the Holmes County community, for instance, has spun off many, many communities. Today, we're the largest community. There's about 10% of the Amish live in the greater Holmes County community. So about maybe 40,000 in the greater Holmes County community. Interesting enough, the 2010 census, we don't have the information from the 20 census yet, 43% of households spoke something other than English at home. And I would guess the largest, 43.1% of that is Pennsylvania Dutch. And so our language, our culture, when we lose those things, that's why I'm so intent on keeping our language. Because you lose something, a piece of your culture. We don't worship culture, but it helps keep us rooted to our way of life.
And our first language for our 4 boys, Pennsylvania Dutch. I know it gives you a funny accent, and when people outside of this area ask me what accent it is, I just say Russian because it just confuses them. But I want my kids to be able to go to Grandma and Grandpa and speak Pennsylvania Dutch.
Yes.
And as they start working with other Amish people, they realize how great that is. And you're bilingual without even trying to learn another language. I think it's a wonderful thing. And it should be something that for the people that are leaving the Amish, I think it's something that's so important to pass on.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And it allows you to travel in places. I've traveled in Europe extensively, Western France, Germany, the Swiss Highlands. I can easily function with my Pennsylvania Dutch and a little bit of German that I don't know. And learning 2 languages is always a gift. But I think even bigger, like it helps us retain our connection to the landscape of our past. I like to just use that term. When you think about landscape, the way lands rise and fall, the hills, the way valleys go into things, every area has its own landscape, but so does our past. And in the landscape of our past, there are these deep attachments to these 3 things, and these cultural pieces help us remind us of those 3 things. Not help us, but remind us of those pieces.
I think what you just described there is the mural.
Yes.
Perfectly explained. Because when you go through that, it's all hills and valleys and conflict. One thing that's constant through there is conflict. And I think that's just a beautiful way to explain it. And I would encourage anybody that's ever in Holmes County to come here. So I want to back up a little bit on another group. It's the German Baptists that are also dressed plain. Where, like the Horse and Buggy Mennonites, what's the history on them? And then the German Baptists that also then, like the Swiss Brethren, the Bruderhof.
Yeah.
Like I would like a little more history on these. I don't want to call them fringe groups, but groups that I'm not
The
knowledgeable
German
of.
Baptists are a pietistic group that comes out of the American experience. So Pennsylvania, they come out. There's some Moravian influence, like from Moravia, the pietistic groups that immigrated. Horse and Buggy Mennonites are Anabaptists. They're just Mennonites who have decided not to drive cars, but they have church houses, which differentiates them from the Amish. Also, their men don't wear beards, and the Amish men wear beards. And then the Bruderhofs, they started in the 1920s. I found this really fascinating. Keim Lumber, large local lumber, their largest customer are the Bruderhofs. They make playground furniture for like New York City schools. They have embraced many of the kind of Hutterite ideals, but they're a movement that embraces kind of Anabaptist principles, the Hutterite ideals of community living, and then kind of an evangelical fervor. So they began with Eberhard Arnold in the 1920s. There are some connections to our world. They would embrace, in many of these places, brethren that were cousins, theological cousins. Amish and Mennonite were maybe siblings, but they're theological cousins. We embrace many of the same principles. And again, in that theology, there's 3 pieces of it. An adult decision to follow Christ. We call it nachfolgen, walking after. Make a decision to walk after Jesus and walk like Jesus. So the discipleship idea, and then the idea of mutual aid, love, and care for each other. And then non-resistance. And non-resistance is not simply not fighting. It's about choosing life rather than taking life. The story of Dirk Willems perfectly describes. So all of these groups, the German Baptist, all of those groups embrace kind of those 3 big principles that make Anabaptism.
Where are they located, the Bruderhof?
There's Bruderhofs in New York State, across New York State. They're in Pennsylvania, New York, and then several other places in the United States, and one in England, and one on the continent in Europe somewhere.
Okay.
And there's one starting in Asia.
And they would drive?
Yes.
Okay.
So many of them, this is really unique in that many of them are professionals, lawyers, doctors who are kind of jaded with modern life and want a much more communal life and embrace. So many of them are really intelligent people. Their playground factory or playground furniture factory, or children's furniture and school furniture, their factory is very, very lean. So they kind of capitalized on their skills and did lean manufacturing. So many of them are engaged in those worlds. And some of them work away and then come back to the commune for their life. Others do work together on the commune. But again, they're a more modern movement. When they come to America, there's Mennonites and Amish and Hutterites. And the other groups have all originated out of those three main groups.
Now, when, like the Beachy Amish, did the Beachy Amish start with the Amish, right? So they just became the car driving Amish, basically.
They were concerned about proselytizing, evangelism. The Amish have always, they said missions are important, but the first mission, the first and the most important mission is for me to live well where I live and raise my family well. So there's very, very little emphasis on missions. The Beachy Amish wanted more of an emphasis on world missions and drive. So in the 1920s, they begin in Pennsylvania, Lancaster and Somerset County.
So when you look at all the different denominations, you start kind of with the old order would have been the original in the middle.
Yes.
And then you had, you went New Order and you went
Schwarzentrooper.
Then the Danners. You've got, it almost seems when one went more liberal and one went more conservative. So there was that balance almost.
Yep.
Yet they don't agree, but they'll still help each other out. It's really unique how they believe the exact same thing, but it's just a different stance on culture. They'll meet each other on the road on Sunday morning going to their separate church who they think is the right one, but they wave to each other.
See, I think that I'm fascinated with this idea that when a group becomes too large, they're outliers, and the outliers weigh the branches down, and they eventually break off and start their own thing. And I think that's just a really good illustration. It's happened in every group, from Catholics to Amish, and from Buddhist to Muslim. Every group, this happens, and the same is it's true of us. We're humans. I once met with a group of Amish bishops and said, so tourists ask me all the time, the Amish, what can you tell us about the Amish? And one old guy says, tell them we're just humans. We have our own problems. And it's a good approach.
And I think that's kind of where the Plain Project, how we got started, was to try to show people that these are human beings. They're regular people. They just look at the world from a different lens and choose not to be a part of it. Like, well, I don't want to be embarrassed when I ask them a question. Ask them a question.
Yeah.
Just be respectful. A respectful question will always get an answer.
I tell tourists who visit here, they ask, can we take pictures? And I said, absolutely, you can take pictures. Just don't treat them like zoo animals, because they're not. So, don't get up in their face and do. So I said, but talk to them. You'll discover they're human. We're not some kind of superhuman or subhuman. We're humans. I'm going to go home and chop some concrete out in my basement tonight. If I bust my thumb, I will have the same urges you all do when you bust your thumb, because I'm human.
Yep, exactly.
Well, and I think that all comes back. It doesn't necessarily come back to worldview, because it actually comes back to dress.
Yeah,
that's what I think. Part of the reason why people are afraid of saying the wrong thing, because of the way that the Amish dress. It makes them stand out. And then there are the old wives' tales and the myths and all that kind of stuff that go along with those people that have beards and wear suspenders and the same clothes. Because if they wore the same clothes we did, we would have no idea if they had a different worldview. We probably all have different worldviews ourselves, but we still talk to each other. And I think it's the dress. That's what it comes back to, really, is what I've seen.
And it's also been perpetrated in our modern world by the media. You know, the shows, Amish Mafia and Breaking Amish. Well, that could somebody once asked me, is the Amish Mafia real? No, it's not. I called the producer, and they laughed at me. They said it's not about reality. It's about selling. It's about money. And so there is no such thing like that, but there's still people who absolutely claim. I told the one lady, I said, well, if that's true, then Princess Diana's still alive and living in Saudi Arabia somewhere. And she's like, no. And I said, I saw it in the National Enquirer. It has to be true. And in some ways, the modern world has embraced the media perspective of the Amish. And some of it is good, and some of it is rightly deserved, but much of it is they've not done their homework. You guys are.
Because right when Amish Mafia came out, I had so many coworkers have all these questions. I'm like, well, here's the rule of thumb. If it's a reality TV show with Amish people on it, they're not Amish.
Yeah.
They're not practicing Amish if they're on a reality TV show. End of story.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be accurate. But
the only Amish Mafia I know is when Mike and I talk politics.
And
wait. Anyway.
That could become very interesting, and nobody would want to listen to that.
No, you're absolutely right. There is just no those kinds of things. So I think you're right. And it's like, because we look different, the world assumes we are different, and we're not. We're humans. Again, I asked a group of Amishmen, when people ask me, why do you wear those pants? One of them said, to cover myself. And that's a good answer, because all of us make choices. They said, well, why are my pants any stranger than yours? I mean, buttons were invented long before zippers, and mine are much more practical. Oh, that's a good point. And the older gentleman said, Amish guy said, look, it's about culture. It's the way we've done it. It's a good way of doing it. And it's okay for us to do it this way. If you want to visit Behalt,
yes,
please do come and visit. We are located near Berlin. We have a web page at Amish Mennonite Heritage Center or Behalt.com, or reach out to Mike and he can tell you how to get there.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody that listens to this, if you're in the area, come take a tour. We can't do it justice by describing what it is, and you do such a wonderful job of putting the pieces in place. I think I've been through here 4 times now, and every time there is something that sticks with me. So, Marcus, thank you. Thank you for everything you do here and for joining us.
Thank you.